do about a dozen or so of these public discussions each year. We have several coming up in March and April. If you're not on our list and would like to be on it, just put your name and email address on the clipboards that Ange will circulate now, and then we can do that. I had a call about half an hour ago from our other speaker, Noor Alideep, who's the chair of the Canadian Federation of Students Ontario, who was on the way to the hospital because a very close family member of hers just had a serious heart attack. And so she apologized profusely, and I assured her dealing with real life issues, like immediate health family issues, takes priority, but she felt very badly and wanted me to convey her regrets at not being here. I am, however, really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker on the topic. Len Findlay, who's a bit of a hero of mine, and I have very few heroes, is a distinguished university professor emeritus from the University of Saskatchewan. He's an English professor, a Victorianist, I understand?
Yeah.
But is well known for his work. He was a founding member of the university's Indigenous Humanities Group. He trained in 19th century European elite and radical cultural history and production. And his Canadian work has looked at the Indigenous settler interface historically and currently, the distinctiveness and endangerment of the humanities in Canada, and the distinctive connections between academic freedom and politics. He served for almost a decade on the Canadian Association of University Teachers Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee and chaired it for 2 terms. He's also one of the few genuinely progressive faculty members who's a member of the Royal Society of Canada, and in fact was elected president of Academy 1 of the Royal Society, is the Academy for people in arts and humanities. So he's, and I hesitate to say this before you start speaking, but when I write a paper, I spend hours, days, and weeks trying to get it sounding intelligent and clear. And Len can give a talk extemporaneously as if he had been working on it for months, and can, in his extemporaneous remarks, sound more coherent and learned and clever than I can in months of working on a paper. So it's always a pleasure not only to hear the content of what he has to say, but also to hear his expression of it. And he's going to be talking to us today on the topic of this, which is defunding difference and dissent on campus. Why should Canadians care? And with what the Ford government is doing. I mean, there are so many odious aspects of it. I was at a meeting, open house, a roundtable that the administration of Ryerson had yesterday to talk about the implications of Ford's apparent gift to students of a 10% reduction in tuition, which is badly needed. We should have no tuition in my view, but that's another matter. But the government is not going to make up that lost money to the university. So in Ryerson's case, the 10% reduction coupled with the normal inflation is going to be a $44 million cut to the university's budget. And given its, after you put aside those things that are fixed costs, aren't cuttable, that effectively leaves about $450 million, and so $44 million of that has to be cut. So it's going to be a lot of things affecting students, despite Ryerson's best efforts to prioritize students, that are going to be affected. And in the meantime, the other aspects of what he's cutting for students is going to be quite serious, and on top of that, his final attack on organizations like the Canadian Federation of Students and student unions across the province is to make opt-in membership, which is going to effectively weaken them in ways that he'll and his government will be very happy with, because student associations have been amongst the most prolific critics of both federal and provincial government post-secondary educational policies. So Len's going to be dealing with various parts of that. I'll turn it over to Len. And
Thank you, Jim. I'm very, very disappointed that Noor isn't here. I'm a great fan of hers, and I think that the Canadian Federation of Students is perhaps the most effective voice in exposing the enormity of what the Ford government has done and what it is proposing and what it is probably mulling over for the next stage of the dismantling of some of the things that make Ontario universities and Ontario society and Canadian society imperfect though they be, vibrant, fairly just, and fairly progressive kind of places. I'm glad to see you here. The weather has been spectacularly rotten since I've been I've been here since last Thursday, and in my room down at the hotel looks right over Lake Ontario. It's been it's been spectacular, and I came from Saskatchewan where we've had the coldest February in 39 years, since 1939 rather. But it was nice to see that the army wasn't called out in Toronto during the windstorm, and that you're as hardy as ever. Since Noor isn't here, I hope that we can engage in a conversation, and because you know more about the realities on the ground here, and my presence here is an indication of solidarity, a solitary reminder that Western Canada isn't full of anti-intellectual rubes who wear yellow vests and drive big trucks to Ottawa in order to convey in problematic ways some legitimate kinds of concern. All of Canada is watching Ontario at the moment. There is enormous concern about the implications for our other jurisdictions. What happens here is will it be coming our way soon? And so this is both prudence as well as solidarity, the concern. To simply just identify a couple of things that need more work and need certainly faculty voices and academic leadership in Ontario to amplify these concerns, to grow some political traction that can stop this juggernaut in its tracks and get people to backtrack, to reconsider, and to relent. And one of these is the ideology and the discourse of crisis. Was there a crisis of free expression on Ontario or Canadian campuses? Emphatically no. Is this a fractious topic? Yes, and universities are supposed to be about the fractious but productive performance of difference, the discovery of ideas like your own, but also the productive encounter with ideas that are not yours. So the whole idea of crisis as manufactured, and it has a kind of double dimension to it. The manufactured crisis is a form of entitlement for government intervention where they don't belong. And the manufacture of crisis by the government is also a distraction from the real crises that people are understanding through the underfunding of institutions, through the very uneven access that young people particularly have to post-secondary education. And so that whole question of crisis needs serious work, many different voices from many different vantages intervening with us. There's also here, I think, the question of, while Noor is, as the Ontario president of the Canadian Federation of Students, is mobilizing and demonstrating the usefulness, the political utility of a national organization. At the very moment when she is very prominent in the media and very prominent in in the theatre that people across Canada are following in Ontario at the moment, well, she is demonstrating the vitality and the real pressing need for effective voices that represent a multitude of students. At the very time she's doing this, she's having to deal with attempts to decertify at the University of Toronto and Mississauga. I mean, and this is an attempt to, it's not only an anti-labor, anti-organized animus that the Ford government has, any forms of organization that empower voices that the provincial government care not to hear. Any attempt any instruments that work in that direction are going to be subverted. They're going to be delegitimated. And so the Canadian Federation of Students, it seems to me, and I will end with my remarks with quoting their key goals. But what's happening at the moment is menacing, and it is alarming for progressive organizations of any sort within the post-secondary domain and indeed beyond it. What I had hoped today was that Noor would speak about things on the ground in Ontario that she knows far more about and you know far more about than I do. And I would point to a common predicament, which is that there are challenges inside the academy as well as challenges outside the academy. And so what one needs is a strategy that always thinks in the double register of home and away, what's happening inside, but how that inside connects to outsides, where there are obvious enemies and oppositions, but where there are potential allies that can help in a kind of common cause. And so I will suggest something about that division and how it works and some potentials, and also urge us to, what can we learn from the past that can empower us in the present, not to be a prisoner of that past, but I'll make a couple of suggestions about parts of the record we could go to and remind ourselves that coalitions of progressive forces in the name of education justice and social justice can come together, and they certainly can come together in a moment like this, because the upside of the boor in a bubble, as I call Doug Ford, the upside of the boor in a bubble is that what he is doing is so outrageous that there should be outrage inside the academy, and outrage, you know, health is coming our way, despite the reassurances of the minister that health was not in play as part of a privatizing agenda. We'll maybe find something. But health and education, I mean, these are the live rails. These are places where you can mobilize people into forms of effective rejoinder, resistance, and ultimately removal. So we'll have a look at that history too. But few,
I'll just move out of the
yeah,
so I don't block
sure.
people's view.
And so why should other Canadians care about studying, about those studying in Ontario universities? We'll have a look at that. And I would also say something about the current conjuncture. Where are we? And where we are, I think, is that the attacks on student organizations within universities are the shift from predictive policing in society into a kind of predictive policing on campus, in which you identify certain neighborhoods, like particular disciplines, you identify certain organizations, and you assume, because you're using stereotyping to justify your targeting, that you begin to police campus speech, campus activities by concocting forms of policies, wrapping them up in particularly disingenuous and misleading ways. But actually, you say, this is where our grief is coming from in a political sense. So we're going to do that. I'll have a brief history lesson from 1968. A very good year in my memory, and it needs to come back. And have a look at academic freedom in this context, and the need for solidarity signaling rather than dog whistling. The Ford government is dog whistling all the time. Things are coded in particular kinds of ways. Transparency, everybody's in favor of transparency in government. But a government that actually has its own media outfit and keeps inside a bubble and is absolutely opaque to the ordinary Ontarian. For that particular government to be touting transparency is, I think, particularly disingenuous. And it's not only transparency, of course, it's kind of value for money. And these are coded ways of signaling to the base while intimidating communities of potential critics, particularly on university campuses. And the question really, and it's always the question, but it takes particularly pressing forms here, is, I mean, how do we build an intergenerational, intersectoral, anti-racist, anti-capitalist movement? How do we do that now? And we're doing it at a time, you know, and often when things at home look so ominous, you can look out into the world, itself a very mixed picture. And so I was struck last week by the contrast between the convoy coming to Ottawa from Alberta and picking up some very alarming support along the way. At the same time as in Europe, school children were on strike, insisting that climate change was real, their future was imperiled. And so the idea of youthful voices mobilizing, you know, through the leadership of a 15-year-old Swedish teenager, a wonderful image, the idea that young people have a real stake, maybe the biggest stake. Their voices need to be heard, and they are capable of organizing themselves internationally in ways that their elders and alleged betters could learn a very great deal from. All of this at the same time, so optimism and concern, while angry white populism was taking its convoy across Canada, encountering Indigenous resistance in Ottawa, those wonderful, awful moments, white guy from Western Canada saying to an Indigenous woman, if you don't like it in Canada, leave. So the first inhabitants of Turtle Island being told to leave. I mean, it's just, and somebody else, do you have a job? And you can see how stereotyping that is there in predictive policing is also there in the burgeoning politics of resentment, particularly in Western Canada, and particularly around energy issues. So why should Canadians care? They should care because of the iconic status of Canada's heartland, the expression used by the Queen's economist Tom Cruikshank. But I think it's Canada's heartland in all sorts of ways, and that what happens in Ontario doesn't stay here, particularly at the moment. And there are connections emerging in the name of resistance. Isn't that great? Doesn't that warm your heart? The triumph of angry white masculinities in the name of Canadian leadership. I mean, how awful is that? but it's the reality of the right organizing and colonizing issues, capturing discourse, seeming to be progressive, seeming to be fair, and certainly not. Pardon? Oh, all right. That's right. I mean, but obviously, it takes a Torontonian to just project him in there and into the mugshot. That's right. So one of my propositions to you is that the only apt politics at the moment is an intergenerational one. And it needs to build on the fact, Stephen Harper said that young people don't vote. Well, that came back to bite him. All it needed was barbaric cultural practices and some other gems of social policy littering the end of that federal government campaign. And young people came out in force, they mobilized, they voted, and they voted him out. And so to build on that particular moment of effective politicizing of youth and intergenerational politics. And I think that generational difference dissents from the muscular singularities and economic monoculture of the hour. And behind this lies the politics of difference. I mean, I would argue that in none too subtle ways, Rob Ford would like to refight in the Canadian Academy. He would like to refight in Ontario universities. He would like to get things back to old stock settler views of things in all sorts of ways. Because difference, I mean, if there's lots of difference on campus, and that difference is not a libertarian fiction, but that difference is real, then you have to understand difference as enrichment. What you bring to the table that's valuable is your difference, and you perform it in productive and respectful ways. So difference as enrichment, because otherwise difference is disturbance, difference is impurity, difference is contamination, difference is inefficiency. So there is behind this all the notion that difference, insofar as an occasion of dissent, difference is something that we don't want. Difference is something we have to demonize. Difference is something we have to silence. And those are as enormous stakes in Canada at the moment as one could possibly have. And the idea that there's only one thing, this is what the transformation through neoliberalism of the liberal arts into the neoliberal arts, the attempts to control the university, to monetize it, to commodify education, all of those attempts need to be, there are different versions of the economy. There are different versions of what education should do. And those cannot be pressed into some sort of singularity, because if there's only on campus and in society, if there's only one way, that way will be the way of the dominant. And so you need diversity in order to interrogate and resist and transform the dominant. And there can be no speaking truth to power without speaking youth to power. And of course, whether you're outside Queen's Park with a placard or you're inside the legislature and being urged to wash your mouth out with soap and water, as happened in that particular encounter. And speaking truth to power has to include, in an intergenerational way, speaking youth to power and the support of student concerns by the professoriate, by the leadership, by individual faculty in a way that hasn't been evident, to my mind, so far in Ontario. So there's a campus need for a new social contract, I think. Students and young and mature, newbies, returnees, they're all incarnations of energy and diversity and dissent. And what I think is the creativity and critique that difference and dissent bring. These are enormous values. You impoverish the project of post-secondary education if you don't think in those terms and act in those terms. And students deserve allies, fellow advocates, and who can they look to for support? Well, I don't think they can look to academic managers, for many of whom students are revenue units, preferably voiceless, and dangers to the brand, potential dangers to the brand. Students, they're inconveniently independent. I mean, I thought that inconvenient independence was another word for education. I mean, you find your own voice, you fight your own corner, you make your own stands, you intervene according to your lights. All of that is being demonized and discouraged at the moment. So students need to find common cause. They need to get academic staff associations so they work together. One of the things, that I admire so much about newer and student leaders, they have done a far better job, in my view, than the OCUFA, the Ontario Coalition of Faculty Associations, and the leadership. This is outrageous. Where is the outrage? People should be joining together to name what is happening and to deplore what is happening and to alert people to the ominous nature of what's happening and what's going to happen next. Well, I guess that when health hits the public sphere, what they're proposing there, what you'll see is reassurance and betrayal as the double sequence that the Ford government. So it was great to see Sting serenading the auto workers, but Sting is not enough. I mean, the cultural work of resistance is important, but the political traction is absolutely essential. And in the middle of this, what you have to see is, I think that you can't confidently look, either as faculty or as students, to the university leadership, which has in many cases been taken over by management, and the rise of academic managerialism. And I put up here one of my oldest enemies with whom I've been duking out for many years, Peter McKinnon, who was for 11 years president of the University of Saskatchewan, then went to Athabasca University, which he tried to transform into a call center, an educational call center. And now he's down at Dalhousie as the interim president there. And he's a great fan of Jeffrey Keller and George Kellner, rather, sorry, and academic managerialism. And I put up here a quotation from McKinnon's most recent book, which is called The University Commons Divided, Exploring Debate and Dissent on Campus. And he was the principal author on the revised academic freedom policy for Universities Canada, which is an inferior document, an attempt to reduce freedoms and to characterize students in particular kinds of ways as a result of this. But he says in this book, universities do not exist to pursue social justice or comfort, and they must not have their purpose and activities bent by those more interested in crusades than in the hard work of intellectual life. Now, that is a very, I thought universities were another name for social justice movements, but this attempt to separate the two is a symptom of particular leadership. And notice the kind of tone here of is very confident, do not exist to pursue social justice or comfort. To link social justice and comfort is a cheap shot I hope you agree, of a very transparent sort. But it's the idea, and behind it all, and the idea of crusades, again, it's a discourse of disparagement, behind which lies a real animus that academic leaders, remarkably, in only too many cases, see the faculty as the problem and the students as the other problem. And yet they're supposed to be the main advocates for the academic enterprise in its alignment with an effective address of social justice issues. At Dalhousie, when the president was introduced, the interim president was introduced, colleagues at Dalhousie had asked me, when it was announced that he was taking over from Richard Florizon, asked me, what should they do? And I said a very subversive thing for an academic. I said, read his books. And they read his books, and the students read his books before he came in, including spectacularly stupid things on blackface. He was called on blackface, but the students stayed in the crowd when the interim president was being introduced. The students were in the crowd, and they were silent, and each of them carried a placard on which there was a quotation from his book. His most recent book. And once he got going, the students silently came out and held up his words. They silently cited and quoted him. And he ignored them. He ignored their existence. He finished his remarks as though they weren't there. The chairman of Larry Starder, the chair of Larry Stordy, the chair of the Board of Governors, when the students protested, the president becomes the victim. The president becomes the precarious person. The president needs to feel some love. And so the chair of the Board of Governors said this. So the students had done their homework. Each of them had taken a crucial quotation from the book. They were doing what good students do. They're studying the primary text. They're reading it critically. They're reciting citation as an occasion for further exploration. They're doing exactly what students should do. And here is a spectacular version of the paternalism and condescension that reigns in key places in universities across the country. If students read the passages they're protesting against, how disparaging and insulting is that? Shut your mouth. A, you haven't read the material, and if you read the material, you wouldn't have the brains to work out what a deep thinker like Peter McKinnon is really saying. If students read the passages they're protesting against, they're really about disproportionate response to issues without actually understanding the issues and stopping the debate before engaging in debate. They didn't stop the debate. There wasn't a debate. There was a presidential monologue. That wasn't a debate. They weren't stopping the debate. And that's kind of what they're doing. Protesting without really understanding why he said what he said. And the lesson for this is that when people in authority within institutions try to disparage or dismiss the student voice, oh, don't worry your little heads about this, we'll take care of things, Father knows best. Instead of that, what you need to do is use such forms of discouragement and, think of what the Premier has said in several different occasions recently, which is poisonous paternalism. It is condescension, and it should be named as such and repudiated as such. And But the Ford government has chumps, political chumps. So, and here is one spectacular version of this, Jordan Peterson. I was talking at the U of T yesterday, and they're still traumatized by JP and need to find more effective ways of going about it. So that is to say, here's Jordan Peterson. The faster the Ontario Human Rights Commission is abolished, the better. There isn't a more dangerous organization in Canada, with the possible exception of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. One version of the challenge that faces us is virulent anti-intellectualism. But that anti-intellectualism is located not only outside the gates of the university, it is inside those gates as well. And so here you have, after that tweet, then comes the meeting with Premier Ford, prior to the curricular sex education changes, a meeting hitherto publicly acknowledged by neither Ford nor by Peterson, but unearthed by Freedom of Information requests. Part of the ways in which governments like Ford's work is through intense concealment, obscurity, obfuscation, and so on. So freedom of information, you have to go after it. So here you have Canada's most celebrated global public intellectual. I almost barfed as I say it there, but this is what it is, that meets secretly with the premier of the province in order to incentivize and fuel up and give a sort of academic legitimation to what is being proposed and indeed implemented by the Ford government. And then what do you get? You get campus free speech codes and policies in an Orwellian moment of silencers and spinners claiming to embrace and promote openness. And Jim Turk's blog about the Chicago principles, about what's really going on, what's being coded here, is a very important place to start your own inventory of concerns and proposed counters to this. But libertarians take liberties with freedom, is how I would put it. And I think that we need to think about who are students, who are members of the academic community. We need to think of maybe a new kind of personhood, like in the Persons case in 1928, when women were identified, recognized as persons, and could serve in the Canadian Senate. A judgment made in Britain, by the way, not in the Supreme Court of Canada. So empire sometimes has its uses. But the academic person, because the people on campuses who work and study there are being reconfigured, reconstructed, redefined by the Ford government in ways that are deeply reductive and deformative of the realities. So you need a sense of who you are, and that should be that sense of academic personhood should be informed and invigorated by the propositions that difference and dissent are enriching, difference and dissent are not. So what you're doing is reconstructing and reaffirming the academic person marked but not disfigured by difference and eager to dissent whenever they think that's warranted. So that idea, constituted by multiple and changing identities, not simply a consumer, self-generated, negotiated, and resisting the unilateral imposition on you of identities that are unfair to your situations. And the key components of that composite identity, I think, are democratic citizenship, active membership in academic student bodies and student societies, the very things he's going to selectively defund. Student society is empowering, exploring, oppositional, so that the array of student organizations are the basis for, they are the menu for the productive performance of difference, is part of the cultural and political and ethical education of students that goes along with the acquisition of disciplinary knowledge. And also the right to access, also important here, is do the people who teach you have academic freedom? Are they encouraged to exercise it in their curriculum, in their pedagogy, in the ways in which they evaluate you, so that there is a place for alignment. And yet, what we have at the moment is what I call the fragged academy. In broad terms, the extractive economy wants extractive academy. It wants academics to produce a social license for particular kinds of corporate activity. And fracking the academy, the academy should be fractious, but it should be fracked in ways that squeeze out all the resources, that underfund all sorts of areas and all sorts of programs in the university. The university should not be STEM, science, technology, engineering, and medicine. It should be STEAM, science, technology, arts, energy, and media. So whenever you hear STEM, say STEAM, and then get steamed up about the implications of STEM getting all the money. So my question is, how healthy is democracy in Canada? In the state of our universities is a real indication, a real bellwether, I think, about the state of society. And so you can use that and translate that into other kinds of things. But part of it is, are you wasting your time? Should you just keep your nose in your books? Is that what being a good student is? Or do you take a broader interest? And so the question of intellectual work, if the government is virulently anti-organized labor, then go to the category of labor, go to work, and see whether your definitions, your understanding of what intellectual work and academic work is, and then use that as a counter so that the words, the experiences are not being described on your behalf by an outside authority. So intellectual work must be reflexive. The university has to be the subject of inquiry as well as the source of inquiry. And that way you get beyond patterns of concealment, you get into open debate in a particular, and the inquiry cannot be tethered or confined to management or funder concerns. It requires free critique. A real, vibrant university requires free critique from faculty, staff, and students. And when you make your critique, when, like Noor, you use your voice to dissent, to differ from the dominant view on something, you should always expect rebuttal. I don't agree with you. And maybe a fellow student who says this, I don't agree with you, maybe your prof who says that, but you should never have to fear reprisal. And what is happening through the intimidating idiom employed by the Ford government, you put these free speech codes in place or we'll cut your funding. The abusive use of the provincial spending power is the tactic of the bully. It is indefensible in all occasions. It is particularly inappropriate in dealing with students in university situations. You shouldn't have to feel reprisal, but the move of protective policing from neighborhoods in Toronto into Toronto's post-secondary institutions means that people are being targeted. People are going to be carded inside the university. People are going to be singled out. They'll be warned. There'll be a word in their ear. there will be a tap on their shoulder, or there'll be a bit of cold shoulder. And so the chilling of campus, the re-chilling of campus, and in a day like this, it's not hard to believe, the chilling of campus, but the chilling of campus is a very real danger, and it has to be identified. And so for students, I mean, and here are two grounds for solidarity. How we do it? I see students and I have solidarity with them, because what do they need to graduate with? They need the capacity for economic agency in the contemporary economy. They need to make a living. But at the same time, they need to graduate with a double capacity, a double competency. The appetite and the capacity for critical engaged citizenship. And how can they have that capacity if they don't have those diverse conversations, supplementary to as well as internal to their formal programs, that produce a engaged, critical, informed citizenry. What are you supposed to be on graduation? What do you expect to be at university? The question's been around for a long time. This is one of my favorite cartoons. 1947. It was a time when the veterans returning from the Second World War were looking to university to give them a great future. But they found that instead of that those who had profited from war were ready to turn them into particular kinds of products. This is my example. It's a Harry Gutkin cartoon from, he's a North End Winnipegger. And that's the obedience machine, in which you put money in at one end and diplomas come out the other. It's an assembly line, and of course it's very dated, and so that the product, this is very much Doug Ford's vision as well, that you produce safe toys, you produce people who don't dispute government and power structures. And it's dated because, of course, it's all white guys who are graduating, right? It hasn't been feminized, it hasn't been indigenized, it hasn't been emancipated. But the fear was real there. The fear is real still that governments use public institutions to advance corporate agendas rather than the social justice agenda that we mentioned earlier. Let's see. So where do you find our solidarity? Well, I would suggest that one of the things we might be able to do is to go back to, for example, the late 60s, where what happened on campus connected to broader constituencies of concern and resistance, and they're built transformative coalitions. And so I would suggest the examples of the Situationist International, which came from the University of Strasbourg. Scandal's pretty good. And if you have a look at what they did, I mean, they produced things like poverty in the student environment. It's produced and distributed free, translated into English as 10 Days That Shook the University, rather than 10 Days That Shook the World, John Reed's book about the Russian Revolution. Reprinted in English, French, and Chinese. The print history, the communications history behind this text is wonderful, because it tells you you can get the word out. You can get the word out in effective kinds of ways, and that word can take on a life of its own in particular situations. And then you have to use the repertoire that students at Ryerson certainly have. All these media competencies you have should be used to interrogate authority, and to interrogate authoritarian authority in particular. And get your slogans. Here are there's some wonderful cartoons, and it's like the People's University, yes. beauty in the streets, wonderful stuff, and you have to produce your own, as has been done. No, be young and shut up. There's the paternalism. That's the chair of the board of governors at Dalhousie University, basically. Young people are too often worried about their future. Oh, just believe us. Believe it. No, father knows best. Just shut up and go along with the program. Wonderful kinds of things. But we have a long way to go. Too many workers have been co-opted as yellow vest supporters of an anti-union policy. We have a really difficult moment just now where angry Labour is aligning itself with anti-union politicians. I mean, Scott Moe, his government in Saskatchewan, absolutely union busting, got slapped down by the Supreme Court, hate workers, but he put on his yellow vest, or his yellowish vest, I have to say, and he's standing outside there and he's meeting with the convoy that's of alienated Labour that's coming, of a certain sort that's coming. But the right is not only colonizing the concerns of workers and using that, they're also colonizing post-secondary education and taking its values and objectives and saying, look, we are the friends of students. Well, it's absolute baloney. So you can look at what's happening in Labour, look what's happening to academic work on campus. There are very real dangers of people internalizing the neoliberal instrumentalities of the hour. I mean, too many students. I mean, students are overextended, which is a good way of depoliticizing them, because they're working jobs as well as working through their stuff. But the idea, there's a tendency to internalize things. So notions like austerity. Canada is a rich country, immensely rich country. It's not a generous country. It's particularly ungenerous, I think, to its Indigenous people and its young people. You have to say, if this is unaffordable, well, open the books. There is necessary austerity. Well, what about over there? There seems to be an academic Labour aristocracy, and there's lots of money. Parts of the campus are absolutely flush, and others not. So there's that to be done, and it's to be done here. And I end with a tribute to what's being demonized. What's dangerous, what's wrong with the Canadian Federation for Students? What do they want? Universal access. What do they want? Education justice. What do they want? Public education. If you want to decertify and distance yourself from those three goals, what do you propose instead of them? You propose a neoliberal university in which faculty are independent contractors negotiating, and there is no such thing as student organizations. Students are possessive individuals. They are cranky consumers. They are promoting consumer sovereignty of the cranky consumer rather than intellectual authority. And what you end up is with the destruction of Canadian universities and the impoverishment and weakening of Canadian democracy rather than what we have had hitherto with all its imperfections, which is a vibrant system constantly trying to reform itself, largely through pressures and through persuasion from a diverse student body. So I'll leave it there. And welcome your sense of how, I don't know the details of Ontario's reality, but I hope I empathize.
I mean, does Len's description of what's happening resonate with your experiences as faculty or students or staff in the university? What's your sense of what's happening now in response? Back on the table as you go out are some materials from the Canadian Federation of Students with response to the current initiatives of the Ford government. But what are some reactions you have to what Len has said and what's happening, what you see happening currently in Ontario? Yeah.
And I'm not a student.
I'm sorry, wait a minute.
I know it seems silly to use a mic, but because we're recording it, it's the only way we can get
Yeah, this is being live streamed and also going to be a podcast. So if you could just introduce yourself and
Yeah,
Mike.
my name is Dave Kronsolver. I'm a member of the TTC Riders because they want to raise the fares to 10 cents, so we're trying to fight that, amongst other things. But I was in the community worker program at George Brown College, graduated a long time ago. But the way I see things is that the universities are becoming, like you said, corporatized, neoliberalism all around the world. Personally, you see how Jeremy Corbyn is being treated in Britain. But I think, and it just seems like the right is just becoming more and more powerful, but at the same time, we're fragmented. Because I still see also with Jerry Diaz supporting, saying that we need to create more cars, but going up against the Mexican workers. But I think we have to keep just organizing ourselves and fighting against this neoliberal agenda and just against the right. I know the left is very fragmented in this city. But I feel that I'm an activist and I'm a socialist and just keep fighting and organizing. And I think that's the only way we can try to win.
But one of the difficulties is it feels sort of overwhelming. These things are happening.
Yeah.
Can they be stopped? Ford has a majority, and so what can we do? But the fact is, we have to play the long game.
Yeah.
And unless voices are heard about what this means for students, what this means for faculty, what this means for society, what's the quality of education we're getting as a result of this, what kind of society, unless we hear those voices, possibilities of change in future go down the tube. Yes?
Yeah.
Do you want to give, yeah.
Hi, my name's Kiki Sakota. I'm the managing editor of the Ryersonian newspaper here at Ryerson, and I'm a journalism student. And just one comment I want to make about something that's scary to me about the Ford government is his demonization of media, and I think that is for sure going to trickle down to university campuses, especially since he made ancillary fees, some of them optional. So a lot of campus papers are going to be getting defunded, and that is like quite frightening to me, like graduating this year and going into the job market, because the Canadian media is already suffering, and for our provincial government in a province as big as Ontario to be acting that way toward media and like barring media from events and stuff like that, and just kind of being very hostile towards them in like a Trump type way.
Fake media, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like to be called fake news is really upsetting when you've worked for a degree for 4 years. So I think that I definitely have some trepidation going into the next 4 years, but it's also a really great time for investigative journalism and for journalists to kind of like create good unions and stuff like that. So. Yeah.
Could I just ask a question before Len responds? What is likely to happen to the Ryersonian and the eye-opener with the Ford's announcement?
Well, the Ryersonian is actually like a course that we take in order to graduate, so I think it'll be okay since like we technically pay to take it. But the eye-opener is definitely in peril because they do get ancillary fee money, so it's really disheartening with these cuts coming up. And I know that a lot of different student publications across Ontario are trying to deal with it.
Well, the first thing I did when I entered the building was pick up my Ryersonian. And I did the same with the varsity at U of T yesterday, because the Canadian University Press, the umbrella organization for student papers across the country, the sheaf on our campus, absolutely invaluable. As a place for experiment, You know, many people will write one editorial in a student career for the student paper. They'll never write another one, but they learn from the experience and what so it's it's invaluable. And it attests to the fact there is a student voice. That voice is diverse in its concerns, in its aspirations, but it recognizes the place of a free press in any democratic society worthy of the name. It has huge set of positive meanings and positive opportunities for students to empower and inform and better inflect their own voices. Now, why should that ever be a target? It is a target if you look at the anti-media animus that has come up from Trump all the way up to Canada. And the idea of, I mean, Stephen Harper was averse to sitting down with the media, tried to dismantle the CBC and so on. But these institutions are invaluable, and the fact that the provincial government's media practices should be a legitimate topic for exploration and investigation from students with your interest and expertise. And that's why, so why is something targeted is one version of the question. And why now? What is it that's available and coursing through society that takes crucial democratic competencies and demonizes them as problems or as unaffordable and uses funding regimes in order to target them and welcome their dissolution? My question is, where is the outrage? And where is how can the concerns that are expressed in those who produce and those who read the Ryersonian, how can they be amplified into an effective resisting voice?
Yes.
Hi, my name's Kelly from the library, and I'm just wondering if you think that the students and faculty need a new communication strategy to combat the populist Ford government and the alt-right, because they have a really good communication strategy.
Yeah.
Anytime we say something, we're the radical left,
Yeah.
even if we're moderates.
Yeah.
Right, so
Yeah.
if you said the student newspaper was closing, he would spin it as, well, it was just a radical left newspaper,
Yeah.
or it's fake news.
Yeah.
So what can the rest of us do to combat this communication strategy that they have that's so effective?
Well, it's a huge question for every organization that I belong to. How do you get your word out? How do you, if I can quote Judy Wilson-Raybould, how do you get the chance to speak your truth? It's enormously difficult, but I think that within universities are communities of accomplishment and aspiration. There are loads and loads of smart people. How can they transform that capacity into an effective? I think it needs more than one strategy, certainly more than one platform. Some people are happier trying to write to the Globe and Mail or the Star. Others are on social media. In both cases, there are, and then there are student newspapers. There are all sorts of things. But I think that we have a credibility advantage. I think that institutions and those who work and study in them, post-secondary, have a credibility that don't choose ignorance, choose education, right? And that, I think, is one basic affirmation. You start there. You don't accept the frame as it's established and the communications terms, the discourse of the Ford government. You make your own frame. You generate your own discourse. You take a notion like education justice, but you give it some traction, you give it some impact, and I think that the faculty voice is often regarded as the voice of a privileged guild. It's the voice of complacent entitlement. It's the summer in the hammock at the cottage, shipping Chardonnay and reading Proust. It is that idea of privilege and indolence. The student voice is a far more politically resonant voice because it immediately raises the question of fairness and the question of hope. And so I think that any communication strategy that speaks from inside the student body in all its diversity of aptitude and need, the voice that's located within the student body, the voice of the students or the voice of solidarity with those students has a far greater public resonance and a greater hope of positive receptivity than a voice which is another free-floating individual pundit or expert over here who's in the university and therefore doesn't know what the real world is about. So the primary place to start, I think, is to start inside amplifying student concerns.
Any other questions or comments?
My name is Rebecca Hagee, and I'm a retired faculty member from the University of Toronto and founding member of Anishinaabe Health Toronto. I worked within my own faculty to introduce Aboriginal studies and support the diversity of students we had who at one point we spoke 72 different languages in our faculty. And in trying to push through the diversity agenda, there was enormous resistance from the faculty, and they used terms like we're going down the slippery slope to, deterioration of standards, and the big concern was if we kind of confront people into a conformity for diversity, they're going to have to give up freedoms. So this threat to freedom and freedom of choice, I think, is a crucial kind of pivot point for conservative thinking, because this was the rationale that was used to justify the strategy with reducing the student funding for their organizations and addressing the fee structure. And so I'd like to hear what you think about this issue of the freedom of choice being so central in their thinking.
Well, transparency and choice, so the two rubrics under which Ford is proposing this, that the transparency of student governance and the freedom of student choice. And choice connects to the notion of the sovereign consumerist individual. That's one dimension of it. And then there's choice as aligned with the notion of academic freedom on campus, and both of those things kind of often converge together. I've been involved in indigenizing the University of Saskatchewan, and I recognize only too well the ways in which it's framed, that in the argument I would make is diversity is the guarantor of excellence, not a threat to excellence. That is to say, nobody sees the whole picture, But if people of only one sort are looking at the picture, you're more likely to get consensus. And that consensus is probably going to be skewed in the interests of one group, the ones who are looking, rather than those whose gaze is not is disenfranchised and prevented. So indigenization is not only precise and unavoidable and enriching and much delayed agenda that deals with the universities as deeply complicit with the project of colonization in the first place. It's not only that, it's part of a broader diversity agenda. And either you believe in diversity as enrichment or you don't. And it's very interesting that the people who, there are 2 or 3 different attitudes of faculty resistance. And we're talking here about the problems inside rather than problems outside. And people say that it doesn't apply to their discipline. That is, you can have Indigenous people in one sector of the university, maybe in one of its softer sectors, if you put it that way, and rather than it's for all of us. The indigenization agenda is for medicine, it's for engineering, it's for law, it's for education, it's for nursing, it's for everybody. But the idea is that it doesn't impact you. That depends on a fetishizing of the notion of knowledge, in which when you're in the classroom, you're not walking the earth, you're not an embodied subject. Part of the history of that region, which was a colonial history, inevitably in Canada, before it is becoming a post-colonial. You want to have the notion of the disembodied intellect that can decouple itself from social obligation, from history, from the politics of a particular geography. So that's one of the ideas. I live the life of pure mind, so I don't have to think about any of those kinds of things. The other thing is, well, the unconsidered, unreflective belief in the Euro-Canadian project. That's for it. No, this is a Euro-Canadian project, post-secondary education. Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous epistemology, Indigenous culture, Indigenous languages are inferior. Now, there is no such thing as all languages are social treasuries. There is no such thing as a stupid language. There are plenty of stupid people who speak particular languages, but languages are social treasuries. So linguicide, the refusal or the extinction of particular languages is massively impoverishing. Unilingualism is cultural imperialism. Of a sort. So you get people who think it doesn't apply to me. The others who say, I have academic freedom to ignore all of this. Well, is academic freedom the freedom to be a bigot? Is academic freedom the freedom to be willfully ignorant? Is academic freedom the freedom to disparage or disavow a whole set of knowledge that was in place on Turtle Island long before I and people like me arrived here? Well, you tell me. So I ask you push the question back and say, well, could you explain why in your lab, which is, say, in health. Now, are you saying that that the history of mainstream medicine in Canada has no real connection to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, or you're doing political science or law, and that has no impact, really, or no connection to? And of course, there are deep hierarchical and colonial practices. I mean, as Linda Smith says, the word research is one of the most ominous sounding words to Indigenous peoples across the world because they are the object right? It's a unilateral. It is the gaze of the dominant, looking at the curious, the marginal, and the soon-to-be extinct. Now, so you put that right back at them, and you say, well, the alleged disconnection or irrelevance of Canada's colonial history to my particular form of inquiry, the lens I use in my lab, the book that I'm writing at the moment, it's nonsense. But it's a form, because, as the poet Shelley says, there is no unconnected misery. Misery can always be joined back to its antecedent causes and those who have some accountability for the way things are. So you have to push it, and the idea is I'm being forced into something. Well, people comply with all sorts of, the university is a hyper-regulated environment. It is full of responsibilities and negotiable obligations, as well as a place of significant and distinctive freedoms. It is both of those things. So the idea is that I don't want anybody telling me what I'm to do. Well, your life is full of reluctant or enthusiastic compliance anyway. Why not take this on and as part of, and look, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have made it easy for us. They've enumerated the particular challenges directed to universities to decolonize themselves. So those who have been the recipients of the dominant forms of knowledge and the dominant distribution of opportunity and reward, they are being very helpful in telling you what you need to do in order to remedy it. So listen, act upon this, anticipate resistance within the guardians of excellence. There are three waves of major threat. The Canadianizing of the Canadian Academy, more homegrown professors, were supposed to be a hit on excellence, and it would dilute and diminish Canadian universities' reputations worldwide. No. The feminizing, the second wave, is the feminizing of the Canadian professoriate. Well, we can't have any women in engineering. Engineering is a form of cerebral masculinity. There's no place for a woman in it at all. They may walk across the bridge, but they certainly haven't the capacity to design it, never mind to construct it. Well, so that was the next form of alarmism. Canadians in far more obvious presence in the Canadian professoriate, the changing of the gender balance of the Canadian professoriate, and the indigenizing of the Canadian university is being figured as the third threat to excellence. And that will prove to be as unfounded as the other two were. As we try to transform the composition, the demography, the faces of our institutions in order not simply to reflect. There's no reflection without refraction. And that refraction brings with it all sorts of other things, all sorts of opportunities. Perish the thought that the university in its current configuration could learn something from those who are inadequately represented within its numbers. Because the university that's why it's so threatening. When I say that the university should be the locus of inquiry, the place where inquiry happens, but also the focus of inquiry, that it looks at itself, that it needs that double, because it has to be able to look in the mirror and feel something other than undying self-love. It has to be able to see that there are deficiencies in it. And so you anticipate the resistance, you learn from the earlier threats how the alarm bells went off in a similar way and in similarly unsubstantiated ways, and you say, it's okay. Universities are supposed to be about change. They shouldn't be stampeded into it. They have to work among themselves, and there will always be holdouts. There will always be those who, you would think, if you think that universities are free of prejudices? Well, you know, they're not. And there are people who feel they have the right to be a bigot, and don't question me, because then you're outing me in some sort of way in your bigotry. No, we have to have these difficult conversations, and they have to be led in different contexts by very different people. But I absolutely recognize whenever you try to change. I mean, they say like the changing a university curriculum is like moving a graveyard, and I think that gives you some of the sense of what the sensitivities are. But it's territoriality. Well, if you think that you're entitled to your territoriality, think about the land in Canada. Think about who owns Turtle Island, who did it, who owns it now. Think of the Philosopher's Walk on the U of T campus, and then listen carefully for the sounds of Turtle Creek in the Ojibwa and Anishinaabe and other things that go beneath that surface. Read the opening of John Burroughs, Ojibwa legal scholar's book, Recovering Canada, in which at the end of Martin Friedland's History of the University of Toronto, there is a wonderful reflection on the built environment and the distinguished history that includes this pathway called the Philosopher's Walk. Read that, and then read the opening of John Burroughs' book, in which he actually re-indigenizes the U of T. He gets beneath the concrete, he gets beneath the high rises, he gets beneath the incomparable beauties of the Roberts Library in all its fascist architecture, gets beyond all of that. I'm sorry, the library, the books are great, the Fisher Library is great, but the architecture sucks, I think. And it's both of those things. It's both the accomplishments of the predominantly white settler narrative, but it's also those accomplishments in mutually transformative and mutually chastening dialogue with the indigenous narratives of this place, this land, its particular territories. So I think that my advice is, if you're looking for these changes, the mediocrity of the opposition to what the university should be is predictably located in Queen's Park, but it's also located, as you suggest, within the institution, and you have to take it on, and you have to flush it out, and you have to do it in as agreeable a way until you have to be disagreeable, but that's okay too, because it's too important to leave the legacies of injustice inert and uncommented on and undisturbed within an institution whose mandate is what I think it ought to be.
I was going to say this is a good way to end the talk, but if you had something you wanted to say, Becky, or somebody else, we can do that. Oops.
Sorry.
Here's the mic.
You spoke about the discourse of disparagement and the politics of resentment.
Yeah.
And you talked about their little frame, and we should have our alternate frame. And our alternate frame has to be astute to the colonization processes and undermine it with new language or powerful language.
Yeah.
Do you have any guidelines for the sort of tropes we should be using, or the, what can be powerful? I think I mentioned that I was at the pre-budgetary hearings when the students made their petition to the province, and I knew in my heart that their language they were using wasn't hitting them at all. It wasn't, and I did think that, perhaps some intensive semiotic research could have gone into somehow undermining what the MPPs were throwing back at the students.
Well, trying to persuade the unpersuadable, I think, is a futile endeavor. But you have to get beyond them. You have to get beyond them. And so, the very thing that Peter McKinnon disavows, that the university has no relationship to the pursuit of social justice. I think that you say that the pursuit of social justice, you say the outcome of a post-secondary education is that double competency, economic agency and critical citizenship. You put those two things together, and you can build on that. And the idea, and then they'll say social universities and social justice. What do you mean by social justice? And you say social justice is both urgent and elusive. It's a place for exploration. It's a place for negotiation. It isn't one version. And its openness, its indeterminacy, is a rejoinder to the instrumentality, the metrics, the outcomes, the deliverables, and the closing down of possibilities that people like Ford would like the universities to be brought to heel. So it's a production line to feed the economy in its current neoliberal configuration. So instead of that, you say, yes, it's about, are you against social justice? No one will answer in the negative. It's like everybody's for academic freedom until you say, well, what do you mean by that? But these are places of possibility. There are places of contestation. And we have to have places of productive contestation. So you align yourself with social justice. And so that preempts certain kinds of hard-nosed, pragmatic, skepticism about universities and why do they have all these other programs that are no use at all. So you align yourself with that, but you're ready with the next part of this, and that you connect what the students should leave university with a capacity for critical citizenship. Not that they'll be voting for one party or another, but that they participate in the democratic process in critical kinds of ways, at community levels, at provincial and at national and international levels. So that's what you need to do. And as for, I'm trying to think of Doug Ford as a semiotician of a certain sort, and it's too arcane a notion to apply to the boor in the bubble, it seems to me. And so what you need to do is get beneath the locality of the problem in the current leadership, and begin to build the resistance. And when you're looking for and building solidarity, you can use a less circumspect, you can use a more blunt and critical and partisan discourse in order to build the kinds of solidarity that will get rid of this problem in the next provincial election.
Well, Len, thank you very much again. Please join me in thanking Len.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming. And there's some material from the Canadian Federation of Students on the back table around some of these issues if you'd like to have a look at it, including a form they ask you to fill out and express your own views to the Ford government.